This part is the panel discussion. What we aim to do with these things is to really just kind of give a full picture of a conservation story and challenge, and then, in this time, try to think kind of bigger picture of, what's next? What can we all do? Hopefully you leave inspired thinking about what you can each do to help with these challenges. And definitely just time to take the questions you've had burning all day that we haven't gotten time to get to. So thanks again to Garden staff for curating these questions from both online and in person. And I'll just start with one that follows well from Scott's last talk. And it's, why does saving rare plants matter? They represent such a small proportion of wild communities. Does it matter if we lose them? And I know someone who has an answer. She's given before. I think her name is Heather.
Okay. Someone next to me was talking, but I think the question is
why do saving rare plants matter?
Why do rare plants matter? I think there are a lot of approaches you can take to this question. One of my favorites is actually in the language of the Federal Endangered Species Act, which says that endangered plants and animals are of ecological, scientific, aesthetic, and cultural value to the nation and its people. And I think that sums it up really well. But more than that, I think everybody here talked about keeping all the pieces. The rare plants are small pieces of the puzzle, but they're often also the ones that we know the least about. And a lot of us on the panel today talked about this ecological network and the web of life. That's what Denise has devoted a lot of her career to, is understanding how that web connects. And although they can be a small proportion of the web of life, sometimes rare plants are the linchpin. And because we don't know exactly what their function is all the time, we also don't know what we lose and what the ripple effect of that loss might be if we don't protect them. And so, intelligent tinkering means keeping all the pieces, and that means even the small ones, I think.
Thanks, Heather. Anyone want to add on to that?
I would just add that, I totally agree with everything you say, Heather. And one of the things about rare plants, too, that I find insightful for us is that they quite often inhabit small places in large landscapes, kind of like human beings, perhaps, in some ways, and are very sensitive to changes in the environments in some ways. And so we can learn sometimes by their stories, their reactions to change, what we are doing and how we can actually help ourselves as well.
So you all saw all those photos of the islands just denuded of vegetation. How did all those early botanists find all these rare species that we have herbarium specimens for? Either they found the needle in the haystack, or they were really good at finding things, or they were more common. There was talk of the island Berberis. There's only 11. So how did an archaeologist find seed in one of the middens? Either she found that needle in the haystack, or Berberis was more common, and we know that it was used as a food source on the mainland for coastal tribes. So the islands are a little bit different, I think, when we talk about rare plants, in that we know most likely what caused their reduction. Or on the mainland, it's, I think, it's a little bit different. Some things might be rare just because they are rare, and that might be the case for some of them on the islands. But really, I think it's all those introduced animals that reduce them.
I would agree with what John said. And an example of that is the lotus that Denise mentioned on Santa Cruz Island. It was very rare when we started work out there in the 1980s. Like, there was, a few individuals known. It was rare, considered rare in the 1880s. And they mentioned it even back then as being found only in a few locations. Once the animals were removed, it started coming back, and I started saying, oh, this is a rare plant, I better map it. So I started marking individuals, and it's like, okay, we found 3 here, we found 4 there. Then it sort of gradually got to, well, I found a group of 10 or 15 here. Pretty soon it was hillsides. And now it's common everywhere. So just because it's rare now doesn't mean it wasn't common before, and maybe a more important component of the ecosystem before some of these threats came and made them smaller.
And that photo I showed of, or the quote of Blanche Trask is saying that she found, all of, mine just went there, didn't it? The quote of Blanche Trask, stating that she found maybe 4 locations on Nick around 1900 of Leptocyne gigantea, and then the next photo is, 20% of the island is covered with it and getting bigger. So even if it's rare, it might become not rare and have a very significant contribution to the overall ecosystem.
Great, thank you, everybody. The next one is, how do you view the balance of recreation and sensitive island habitats or resources given the current climate of opening islands to more access in the backcountry and surrounding waters?
Since I work for the National Park Service and, and as an agency, we have a mandate to provide for recreational use. But at the Channel Islands, we also had a stronger mandate than many national parks do to protect natural and cultural resources. So it was very clear for the Channel Islands that minimum impact by users was supposed to be our guiding linchpin. And sometimes there's a demand for more intensive use or more impactful use than what some of us were comfortable as managers. So I won't say that we've always gotten it right. I will say that I probably didn't value public use as much when I was working at the park until, like the examples I showed, where it was people who actually had sort of that firsthand knowledge of the islands that were willing to stand up and to say, they saw the impacts that were happening by the non-native animals. So I think the focus needs to be on I think numbers need to be managed. It has to be minimum impact, and that's up to the managers to make sure that they define what that is, and that they monitor what the impacts of visitors are. I mean, to some extent, visitor use, we know that displaces wildlife. We know it has impact even when it's, somewhat, a rather benign, just hiking on the island. So, but I think accepting some of those impacts in designated areas, but keeping it minimal and define the experience that you want visitors to have. So it is okay to establish maximum numbers and then to enforce those numbers. Yeah, and maybe you have reference areas also where you don't have visitor use, and that can also be something that you are then studying to better measure what the impacts are of visitors.
Thanks, Kate. Scott?
We also here have the luxury of being within an archipelago where we can think about how conservation values can be distributed across a whole suite of islands. We talked a little bit today during the talks about the different land managers' mandates for their respective islands, and they're not all the same. And so you can think about how maybe some types of human uses might be able to be distributed across different places. So Catalina Island, as an example, has a small city on it with a lot of easy access to the major population center in Southern California. And so maybe some types of recreation opportunities that the broader public might seek on the islands might be better able to be serviced in a place like that, and that allows for other types of outdoor experiences to be prioritized in other island, individual island units.
John?
I think if you're going to increase recreational and human access, what has to happen in parallel is that your natural resource has to meet that challenge. So by putting in that increased recreational use and not supporting it with biosecurity, with invasive plant removal, with monitoring, it's it's not in balance. And so I think if the pressure is only going to increase, the human population is increasing, and the islands are going to be more attractive as time goes on. I can imagine one day when we don't need to test weapons on offshore islands. Will those become part of the national park? Will those become, 100 years from now, maybe those might be places that are open for recreation. Bill and Kim might not think that might happen, but I can see a day where that could happen. And so I think we just need to make sure that decision makers are keeping the natural resource protections in pace with the human demand on these places.
Luciana?
Thank you. I just want to add, like in Mexican islands, we have less visitation on islands compared to this, and I think that what you said is what you have a great sample here in the Channel Islands. In Mexico, we don't use them as tourist places not much because they're very difficult to access. Not a lot of people have resources to go there. But the ones that are open to tourism, I know that it touches people and makes a lot of, it makes a difference. So it's a way for the average person to be able to approach and to know the islands through one or two that they visit. There is a right way to do it, or close to doing it in the right way, which is, for example, the most recent case in Mexico is Las Islas Marias. Islas Marias was open as a tourist places, and it's being done in a very careful way. Only some areas, and with the biosecurity in place, so very well thought. Other places maybe are not there yet. So, for example, Guadalupe, it's still it had an extensive damage, and still maybe it's going to take a while for be able to take heavy visitation on it. So maybe some places can wait a little bit, and others can be just available for people. So in Mexico we have less islands open to tourism. Maybe will be more in the future, but careful.
Thank you. Okay, this one is shifting gears a bit. Is there a role for fire on the islands, for example, for management of a process to be managed?
Okay, well, as a manager of the island that has the most fires of the ones we've talked about today, I definitely think yes. The fires that we get on San Clemente Island, they are started by unexploded ordnance. Usually we do try to contain them, but the dendromecon, the island tree poppy that came up after a fire, and it was in an area that we've been in many, many times, surveying before, and it was only after 2017 fire, I think we found it in 2021, that we had seen it, and it's probably been up for a couple of years. So yes, definitely, we have found, and we found that elsewhere on San Clemente Island, where we have species rebounding after fire. So I think it depends on the frequency of the fire. It also depends on the severity of the fire. Managing a fire or having a prescribed fire, we've done a few of those on San Clemente Island, and you just have to be very careful about making sure they're within prescription, but there are benefits, and I definitely think there is a place in the landscape of the management of the use of fire.
I think it's not just a question if there's a role of fire, because I think fire is going to be on the island. So the question is it a role of intentional fire or a role of accidental fire? And with climate change, and vegetation changing and increasing due to removal of animals, it's going to be more prevalent because of that. Climate changes could obviously, aggravate the abundance of it, and increasing tourism. Many of the fires, some of the ones on Catalina and other places were started by people with beach fires and things like that. So I think the big question is, not whether there's a role for it, but how do we deal with it, and whether it's, done on purpose or not.
Scott?
Yeah, I just think that, just broadening beyond fire and just thinking about disturbance generally. when you think about the past 10,000 years for some of these islands, they've had a lot of people and a lot of activity on them. And the conservation era for some of these islands is really marked by a lack of that kind of activity on the islands in those systems. And in Denise's talk, she showed a field of blue dicks that we know were cultivated by, for example, the Chumash on Santa Cruz Island. Whatever the management practice was that created that cultural landscape is not in practice right now. And so what does that mean? Is that what is the trajectory of that area of the island now? Because we're not burning it, we're not selectively managing any of the vegetation around it. And I think that these are some of the questions that we're going to have to grapple with if we're thinking about what letting nature take its course means for some of these places that are familiar today as natural landscapes or cultural landscapes, absent some of the disturbances that were probably there for thousands of years.
So related to this question, there's one specifically asking, what's the fire history on Guadalupe?
Well, it has been changing, and well, we have had several historical fires. We don't have the full history, but we do have more frequent that probably the system can stand right now. Just what Peter was saying was very right. I mean, it's not a question, are you going to have it? It's when you're going to have it, and could be for different reasons. The last one that we had in 2021 was a lightning that reached a pine, an individual pine, and that one, it was an interesting case because we thought that it was extinguished. That happened in January for a storm. It didn't have not much rain on it, but the fire stayed underground for several months. So in March, because of the winds, it just came up again and killed something that could have been very, very contained, and killing only one adult tree and few of the young ones. Actually ended up killing 5 trees and many of the new ones. So yeah, we have the story more clear for the cypress forest, less clear for the pines. There's a lot of scars of lightning at the cypress, and you see a lot of burning charcoal everywhere. So yeah, I will say probably every 20 years, 15 years. And so yeah, we need to be prepared. So it's why we're committing a lot of resources and all the thing of removing the field material from the forest and trying to rehabilitate the fire breaks and just be prepared to have the people knowing having the skills to be able to fight them if something like that happens. And also, we talk about a lot of the recovery of the native ones and species, but you have the other side of the coin of the non-native species that you have there. So when we remove the goats, the first years you will see all the grasslands like full of avena everywhere, and that one creates a lot of connectivity, and which is a big risk of fire.
Thank you. This one is specifically for John. Has there been any noticeable effect of pollinator populations given the use of neonicotinoids?
I don't know if I could answer that question. I don't know enough. That would be a good question for maybe David.
He's raising his hand. Hey, David, do you want to take a mic?
So the areas that were treated on Santa Cruz Island with thiamethoxam were a small fraction of the island, about 2% of the island area. And we also use a very dilute concentration of thiamethoxam. Neonicotinoid pesticides, of course, are in the news a lot because they are indiscriminately used in agricultural situations and overused in agricultural situations, and clearly have detrimental effects on a wide variety of insects. They're arthropod specific. We didn't monitor pollinators on Santa Cruz Island in the areas that were treated, but what we have seen, and John showed the graph, was that native ants have come back since the treatments took place. And so that's very strong evidence that the pesticides have degraded as we would have expected that they would, and that the effects are no longer evident at this point.
Thanks, David. What do you say to people who tell you that the islands reached a new balance with the rats or pigs or sheep or deer, etc.?
Well, okay, I've been asked this question actually before, or we've heard this from a lot of people, and I would say that they are correct. There was a new balance with rats and pigs and so on, but it was a balance that heavily favored those invasive species, and it was to the detriment of, our native and rare seabirds and plants and animals. So it was really a value choice that we had. Was that the balance that we wanted? Was that the balance that was the best for the ecosystem? So our goal became that we wanted to change that balance. We wanted to achieve a balance that favored the rare and the native biodiversity of the island, and eliminate what was so common worldwide, because they've been, animals that have been moved all over the place.
And I'd like to say on San Clemente Island, I don't think we ever did achieve a balance with the goats. I mean, the goats, ate the vegetation, the soils became bare, and then we had a lot of soil erosion that was continuing. So it was never in balance. It was always in a downward, state, after the goats got there.
And I would echo what Kim said. I think on Santa Cruz there was never really a balance with the sheep. I mean, we were seeing plants and shrubs where you can see the root ball that was 2 feet up in the air. So in the lifetime of that shrub, they've lost 1 to 2 feet of soil, and that was continuing. And so I don't think you could say that you reached a point where everything was, at a stasis.
Thank you all. What is the process of developing strategies and priorities for conservation?
I can give a nice canned Navy answer for that. We have an integrated natural resources management plan, and it walks us through what the operations are and what the federal laws require. And we go through that entire thing step by step. These plans are several hundred pages long. As Kim showed, just a tiny, tiny fraction of some of the work that would have been placed in one of those. And it covers everything in there, from do the sailors go fishing off the side to are we going to, test weapons on this location? And I think, certain laws they're all followed, but certain ones get funded better. So ESA is typically a very high priority law. Clean Water Act is a very high priority law. So for us, it can be, kind of in that order. But a lot of thoughts going into that, and our priorities change. We actually update those reports every 3 years, and then we rewrite them typically every 5 to 10. And then it also goes through, some of them go through the NEPA process as well. So there are a ton of eyes on these things, and it pretty much goes through all the federal requirements.
I'd like to expand on what Bill said with regard to the Integrated Natural Resource Management Plan. That's a tool that we use in the Navy. San Clemente Island is undergoing its latest update, and we're using open standards. So it's structured decision-making process, and we're using that to look at threats, look at where our efforts might be placed, and also looking at unintended consequences of some of our actions. So we're using that to help identify the actual projects that we'll be doing and to prioritize those, also to see which ones might be most effective so we can make use of resources most efficiently.
Shortly after I arrived at the Channel Islands, we used what's called the Delphi process, and we brought together a group of about 50 Okay, so shortly after I arrived at the park, we used the Delphi process, and we brought together a group of about 50 biologists from both marine and terrestrial biologists with many different specialties, mostly people who knew the Channel Islands, also cultural resource specialists, physical scientists. And what we did was we sort of put together this long list of what did everyone know based on their knowledge of the islands, what were the important things that we needed to do to preserve the ecosystems of the Park Islands. And so we came out with this long laundry list. So then the task was to whittle this down. What's the highest priorities? And so the Delphi process, what it involves is all the individuals on their own rank the projects that they consider the highest priority. And then that information is shared against everyone else's opinions. And then you see, is there a re-ranking? And you go through this sort of iterative process of hearing from each other these different specialties, why certain actions needed to be taken now. And at the end, it was amazing how we came up with sort of like a top 10 priorities that almost everybody across the board, so whether you were an archaeologist, a botanist, a soil scientist, or a wildlife biologist, for instance, there was across-the-board agreement that eliminating feral pigs, for instance, was the highest priority action for the park. And so that really helped sort of chart our course of priorities as opportunities came up or as we were able to get funding to carry through certain projects. And that was what guided the park for approximately 20 years.
I just want to underscore the word funding that showed up in a couple of those remarks. It's easy to plan. If you don't have money, you don't implement. And sitting with the NGO hat on, the fundability of some of these projects is really important to consider. And even when you take that into account, the triage you have to do on your priorities is brutal. It's really easy, especially on these islands, to make a long list of really important things that we should do. And the subset of that we can do because we have funding to do it is really, really small.
Thank you. Uh-oh, this isn't working still. Oh, no, it is. Yay. Okay. Next one is, what does the role of traditional ecological knowledge play for making conservation decisions? Do we have to play God? Can't we just listen to indigenous people who come from generations of people who have stewarded the land?
Well, I think what I would reflect on in that question is how different this landscape is right now, given all that has happened to it, especially in the last 200 years. We have an onslaught of invasive species that will be novel to that traditional ecological knowledge. We have a climate that will be novel in the context of that traditional ecological knowledge. So I do believe that there is a lot that we can learn together, and as I mentioned earlier, just focusing on the blue dick fields on Santa Cruz Island and the lack of really any management whatsoever on them right now. There's probably a lot that we could co-discover there about how best to think about that landscape and take care of that landscape. But I think we're really in uncharted territory here, where we are going to be facing things that none of us have ever had to grapple with, and we're going to need everybody to bring in their ideas and their knowledge and their creativity to bear.
My mic is going in and out, so we're going to do a battery replace, but anyone else want to take that one on? Okay. Okay. Do current federal and state environmental laws suffice to conserve and restore species in a changing climate? If not, what new policy do we need to support biodiversity conservation on the islands and the mainland?
I guess I've always felt more funding limited than policy limited. So certainly, I think one area where there's been some difficulties is with marine management, because there's overlapping jurisdictions, and the boundaries really, like for the boundaries for the park, for instance, really aren't sufficient to protect a marine ecosystem, even for the National Marine Sanctuary. So we are very weak in the marine, in the realm of protection of marine resources. You pretty quickly get into international waters and just a lot of overlapping jurisdictions.
And I'd like to say, whoops, is this working?
Yeah.
That, while I agree that the policy, the laws and policy might be sufficient, I feel like a framework or some kind of mechanism to help us face the challenge of working across vast areas and different jurisdictions, I think that's going to be important in the future if we're thinking about ever reintroducing species, places, and things like that. It's going to require cooperation on a scale that we're not currently doing.
I would also just make the point that for rare plants, the vast majority of them are not protected under any policy. Things that are on the federal and state endangered species lists are things that have had advocates and that have been pushed through the system to get that extra protection. And by that mechanism, they also get more funding. And that's important. And as a lot of people discussed here, that has played a large role in removing the animals from the islands and working on all this recovery. But there are also a whole host of plants. 30% of the plants in California are rare, and a very small fraction of them have any legal protection under the federal or California State Endangered Species Act. So I think that in that way, we don't have policies protecting enough things, and I don't think that we necessarily even need that for every rare species. But as Kate mentioned, the funding difference is real and significant and greatly changes how we're able to do our work. So some of the 14+1 plants that I talked about are extraordinarily rare. Others have co-occurring neighbors on the island that are more rare than them. But the reason we were focused on those 14 is because of their listing status and the funding that comes along with that. So in that way, I think there's a lot of movement that could be done to help bring everybody along and not just those things that have been designated as federally or state listed.
Not to be contrarian, but I don't think we know the answer to this question yet. I don't think we've fully pressure tested policy with what is coming. I think we have, just even over the course of this day, a lot of practice at recovery of things that need help in the place that they are. And we've talked a lot about reintroduction, moving things back to where we know they once were. But the idea of introducing things, we have not developed that muscle yet as a conservation community. And so we don't know what we're going to run into when we actually need to do this much more efficiently than we currently are. And so I fully expect that when we really get our heads around this and try to figure out how we're going to stay out ahead of these climate exacerbated threats, that we are going to run into some need for maybe some policy innovation, maybe some new funding streams that will enable the good work to happen. But I don't think we know yet whether or not we have what we need.
Nice. Thank you all. Can you hear me? No. You can? Oh, sorry. It's a little fickle. All right. The next one is, so many rare species require a disturbance regime to continue to thrive. How do we achieve this in the current regulatory environment, habitat fragmentation, and the new reality of invasive species?
Well, I think we do have a number of species that have thrived and do thrive on disturbance. And my take on this question would be that we need to do this in an experimental framework. We don't know, like Scott is saying, some of the consequences of what we might do. And so I think we need to start with experimentation on large and small scales, perhaps, to decide what we can do and then look at what happens over the long term afterwards. That said, I don't think we can wait forever to see what the outcomes of the experiments are, but I think we need to definitely keep track of what we're doing and why we're doing it, very clearly why we're doing it.
And I think it just highlights the need why we have a term research. In Hawaii, we had a term, it was research by management. And so just that really highlights the need that when you have a management program, document it and keep track of what's really going on and use that as a way to find out some of the questions that you were asking, because I think we're never going to know enough, and just documenting what disturbance is needed is important, and how a species reacts to if you have a fire there. Well, go out and see what did that do to that species. Use that as a chance to find out what disturbance some species might need.
And to follow up on that, I think, some of the islands, like, for example, San Clemente Island, that does have frequent fire, we are documenting what's happening after that and sharing that with, managers from other islands that might not be exactly, parallel, but could be beneficial to them to see what might happen in similar, systems on those other islands.
Thank you.
For many years, people tried to use fire to control invasive plants, and there's been a lot of studies where the seed, unless it's hanging on the plant and is subjected to a certain duration of fire at a certain temperature, doesn't kill the seed. And seed that's on the soil, typically like yellow star thistle, will not die because of it. So I think what we can do, we have to look, kind of turn it on its head a little bit. Instead of using fire to kill the weed, we could use it to stimulate the seed bank. So using fire in different ways or different disturbance regimes, maybe it's not the way we used to use it, but trying to think, how can we use it differently?
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, go.
On Nick, there are so many locations that are down to parent material that we don't want more disturbance. We want to build soil. It's eroding, and and the areas I think of that have a lot of disturbance are beach strand areas that have elephant seals, which is another management thing that's occurring right now. Is these elephant seals are coming into numbers that are huge and eroding feet and feet of topsoil around a lot of the islands, especially San Nick. And I don't see anything surviving in that area. But yeah, and those were above historical numbers. So there's a thought.
Nice, thanks. In our conservation work, has the legal battle become less challenging? Any lawsuits lately?
Well, in Mexico, is that working? Yeah. In Mexico, I believe so. I mean, because there's more awareness. We have seen a change in the last decades how the awareness of the average Mexican of the value of the islands, why to do the restoration, and why sometimes you need to have the bigger picture of what you want to rescue, what you want to restore. And there will be some effects to other species that normally are non-native, but still, I mean, there's a subject that will be always questions, but I do feel that there's more like has been a change in the last years, at least in Mexico, of more people understanding in all levels. I mean, not only civil, the government, but many agencies and yeah, the average Mexican understanding that this is needed. Mm-hmm.
So since you're active, Luciana, this one is for you. You work on so many islands along the Mexican coast. How similar are the ecosystems and vegetation of the islands?
I will say that the islands in front of the Baja California Peninsula, many of the islands up to Natividad, I will say they're very similar. They do share a lot of species, but from there you get getting different ecosystems. We try to manage them, or working on them and looking at them as groups, just to have just to facilitate the work, but they are very different, and not only the biodiversity, but also the challenges or the use or the history of the site. So, yeah, I will say very, very, very different. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So this one is for Kim. What were the critical steps or methods to develop a culture of stewardship within the DoD?
Oh, goodness. I think, as Bill was talking about, I think part of it comes from the Sykes Act, which requires all military installations with significant natural resources to have an integrated natural resources management plan. And that's very prioritized, and it is from above. I think that helps a lot. I do also think that understanding that conservation is also about sustainable use. For example, like on the San Clemente Island, it behooves the Navy to be a good steward of its land so it can continue to train there, so it doesn't have its training areas erode away, and so the training areas aren't infested with things like yellow star thistle or something that would make it really difficult, to train in. And I think the conservation has improved over time in terms of the biologists and program managers, natural resources program managers, conveying that information more effectively to the military operators, so they understand that we all benefit from this together if we are good stewards of our resources.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
There are required trainings for officers that work on bases as well. So it's institutionalized through training. So they will have heard of like the Endangered Species Act and Clean Water Act. So the Navy's pretty good at that, actually, making sure that everyone's aware of what the requirements are. And if you've been warned about it prior to starting a new job, you're not going to be as shocked when someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, we can't do that over there. We have an endangered bird, or plant." So.
And I'll add one more thing to that, too, is that the Navy has been investing more and more resources into outreach, and so that's outreach, to the public, but it's also in-reach. So making sure that the military operators on San Clemente Island are aware of the resources, and we have outreach events. We have like trivia nights and things like that, and we've also had we had a fox that had been injured and wasn't able to be released back into the wild, and so it was captive for many years on the island, and we used that for outreach events. It really garnered a lot of public interest and sort of love of the foxes. So I think outreach, a lot of money put into outreach is really well spent.
Nice. Yeah.
I know that question was directed at Kim, but on the Channel Islands, we're trying to establish a culture of biosecurity, and it's hard to change a culture where you ship stuff out to the island, and you have to do a lot more work to ensure that you're not spreading. For example, we're building a nursery on Santa Cruz, and I shipped out some pipe. I had to go back down to the harbor and tape up the ends of the pipe so no mice or rats could go in those pipes before they're shipped off. Real inconvenient, but could you imagine if a rat made it out to the island, how inconvenient that's going to be? So what we've learned from our colleagues in New Zealand is that oftentimes it's the carrot that is much more powerful than the stick. So instead of always telling people no, doing fun things like a trivia night, rewarding people in some way or acknowledgement for how they have been more aware of biosecurity. I think of Bill Hoyer. If you go out to San Nick, you're waiting at the terminal, and he makes you take off your left shoe. And then he digs in there, and he tells you if he finds any plant material, he's going to make you take off your right shoe, and then you have to clean them out. That's just a fun way of doing it. But in doing so, he's really spread biosecurity as part of the culture. That's something they do. You go to Guadalupe, you're getting inspected by dogs, and everything's gone through. So it just takes a while, I think, to change that culture, be it stewardship or biosecurity.
And you don't want to fail Bill's test.
I did.
I watched somebody get a F on that, and I was really nervous.
It's true.
Botanists should know better.
Indeed. Related to that, are there any recent or potential future non-native animal introductions that island managers are worried about?
I'm always worried about stuff coming out to the island. That's just an ever-present worry, especially when you've inherited an island that doesn't have cats and no rats and no house mice. And that's why we participate in the biosecurity working group, and we have biosecurity technicians look at all the cargo that goes out, and they find stuff sometimes before it goes out to the island. And in bad situation, you might find something after it gets to the island. But we're monitoring, we're watching, and it's an ever-present worry.
I would agree with that also, particularly on Catalina, where there's a public ferry that goes back and forth multiple times a day, and there's really no biosecurity there. It's a constant concern, and you need to really think about what might come out. Raccoons have come out on the boat, things like that. Another example is you never quite know what people have for pets. I've been on the beach on Santa Cruz Island and found somebody walking their iguana on the beach on a leash because it needed to get off the boat. And it's like, you just never know. So it's a constant threat, as Bill said. You never know that as long as there's going to be access in and out, there's going to be that threat.
Yeah, and we at the Channel Islands National Park, we have boats and visitors, going in and out, and there are some attempts, at biosecurity, but it really should be more because the consequences are so great. And we know that we had a cat on Santa Rosa Island. It was apparently brought in by contractors that were doing some work on rehabbing a historic building. And amazingly, that cat was at the entry point to the island where a lot of people were coming and going, and it was apparently there for at least 6 months before someone detected that it was there. So it's very hard to find these animals once they're on the island. By the time something gets there, you probably are not going to catch it until the population has multiplied and spread. So it really is critical that the biosecurity actions, like what Bill's doing, is taking place when you're on the mainland before anything gets on the boat and heads out to the island. And the other thing that happens is shipwrecks or boat groundings. And what we need to do in those cases is have as rapid a response as possible so that we can get on those ships and set traps and do inspections and determine whether anything might have been on that boat. And then if that happens, then you actually have to then start to work on the nearby beaches and start, actually actively searching and probably putting out like infrared cameras to try and detect something new.
Yeah, for us is the same species. I mean, for Guadalupe, we're very afraid of rats. That's why we have this cat, this dog that detects rodents, and it happens. I mean, we saw documented arrival of a rat to Natividad Island a few years ago, which took months to capture it. Even though we were watching it eating the bait and the camera traps, it just took forever to capture it. So it happens. And to Guadalupe goes a Navy ship once a month, and they're very careful, but still, you can never have enough precautions. Thank you.
All right, so we only, we're pretty much out of time. The last question I wanted to pose, and I'll just answer it myself really quickly, is what can nature enthusiasts who aren't professionals do to help protect and restore the Channel Islands? You can volunteer, you can get involved, help with restoration. You can visit and spread the love and the word, but not the weeds or the other critters. You can vote. I think we saw today that, these environmental laws are working. It's what's kept this work going. So let's make sure that they aren't voted down. You can advocate for other people to vote, tell a friend, share a story. Anyone want to add anything?
Donate funding.
Donate. Oh my gosh. Yeah. How could I not have said donate money? Yeah, for sure.
Take photo vouchers.
Take photo vouchers. Use iNaturalist. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, help us understand the biodiversity better. It works. Thank you all so much for being here today. It's been a great day.
Thank you.